Now, while we are very fortunate to have lots of different options for upgrading our Game Boy Color display, it can sometimes be a little overwhelming, and sometimes you just want to know which one's the best. So, the Game Boy Color, a fantastic little classic handheld, now with a wealth of options when it comes to displays. Now, while this is a great thing, it can be a little bit overwhelming. So get yourself comfy, because I've got a few of my Game Boy Color consoles to take a look at, and we're going to do a bit of a deep dive comparison into what it's like actually playing on all of these different consoles. Now, before we start, one little disclaimer. Although the OLED display, the most recent one you can get for the Game Boy Color, is absolutely jaw-droppingly gorgeous, there is a slight issue in terms of trying to film it and the refresh rate of the screen versus the refresh rate of the LED lighting that I was using, and I've ended up reviewing the footage and there's this horrible strobing effect across the screen. You do not see that. You never see that when you're using it to the naked eye. It's just when it comes to trying to film it. And I've tried various different bits of lighting. It is a little bit of an awkward one to film. So if you're going to use this for any streaming or filming or anything like that, you might want to think twice about using the OLED, or you might want to think carefully about your lighting setup. Bit of a weird quirk, but what it has done is it kind of ruined the footage. Now, I did quite a lot of recording for this, and I kind of found my rhythm in terms of chatting through all the different options. I didn't really want to go back and film all that again. I've got ideas for so many other videos I wanted to make as well. So I'm just going to apologize now. I'm putting it out there. I have made the most beautiful Game Boy screen look horrible on my video. Just take that with a pinch of salt. In the flesh, it looks amazing. In the video, I'm sorry, it doesn't look that particularly nice to watch, but it is what it is. Anyway, watch it, see what you think. All right, so here I have 6 Game Boy Color consoles, all of which have a different screen, 3 of which in particular I'm going to be comparing in this video as to what is the best option currently on the market for getting the best experience out of your Game Boy Color. So why have I got 6 on screen? Well, first of all, although there are all of these upgrade options available, it's important to see how far we've come. So I've got an original unmodded Game Boy Color here, so you can see just what a difference these new screen installs make. Secondly, these 2 down here are a slightly different option. They are front lit screens, which was our only option until a few short years ago, when you were able to actually completely replace the screens with new backlit IPS screens in the Game Boy Color. So before we get onto the main, what I'm going to call the big 3, we've got the Laminated IPS screen by Funny Playing in this one. We've got the FPGBC, which is an all-in-one kit that doesn't have any original Game Boy parts in it and has a larger screen display than the original IPS. And we've got the more recent OLED screen, an AMOLED screen, which offers unprecedented levels of contrast, especially in terms of the blacks, but also the rest of the colors have a lot, possibly a little too much of saturation as well. So we're going to be looking very much at those 3. But first we're going to see how far we've come. Now, this here is the original Game Boy Color. The display on this, when in direct sunlight, is very crisp, very clearly visible, and very easy to play on. But you need a good light shining onto it because it's a reflective display. This is why you couldn't put a backlight in it originally, because it displays by reflecting the light that falls onto the front of it. So if you wanted to play this in the dark, now with my lamp off, you'll suddenly see that this is very, very difficult to get an angle to actually see what's going on the display. So what we did in that case was to front light them. Now this one has a front light from a Game Boy Advance SP. This one has an aftermarket kit which is put in and has a layer of like UV curing resin or something in between to try and clarify the difference. But these kits were awful, and I did them at the time because I always like doing the new mods, but this was a very difficult way to play. It was actually much better and much more effective to use a Game Boy Advance SP front light. This is actually pretty decent, but you know, if you compare it to the OLED, you will see that there's no comparison there. The color palette on the original Game Boy Color display wasn't particularly bright either. So when you had the front light from the SP, you look at that, it's not too washed out. You wouldn't even know it was there. So it behaved just like the original screen. So in that case, this was a pretty cool upgrade option. And without any of the other things, I would always say that the SP front light is quite a nice little upgrade to the Game Boy Color, but it's quite involved, it's quite tricky to do. But I just wanted to talk about those being an option, because although there are lots of new kits coming out, it's important not to forget what else you can do. And don't forget, with this, you have got the pixel perfect original display as intended on this hardware, and that's something important not to forget about. Another reason I brought this one out is that this is an original yellow Game Boy Color shell. Obviously the buttons, purple buttons, are aftermarket, but the shell itself is an original. You can tell that straight away when you flip it over and you've got the standard sort of bubbled up sticker and the scratches from the cartridges being inserted so many times. So I'd been asked about the new OLED kit, which came not only with the screen but also a specific shell that fits the laminated display in quite easily. And I'd been asked about how this compares to the original. So I wanted to bring this one out just to show you side by side. It's actually very, very close. The Nintendo logo is actually clearer and crisper on this one and looks actually more official. If you had one next to the other and you didn't know which was the original, you might even think that this was the repro, the fake, because the Nintendo logo looks really clean. So really, I don't think that is an issue. The shade of yellow is very slightly different. It's a little more orangey on the original. This one is a bit more like the DMG and the Game Boy Pocket shade of yellow. I think this was called Dandelion Yellow originally, so it's a little less warmth, I suppose, to the yellow there. Other than that, it actually matches up really nicely. That even like the molding on the back with the Game Boy logo, the quality of it, I think, is really good. It's not quite as glossy. It's got a slightly more matte finish, but aesthetically, I think it looks really, really nice. There are some very slight scratches to the front since I've started using it, so I don't know how it's gonna weather over time, but in the first instance, and the fact that to get the shell, it costs like £5 more than it costs to get just the screen kit, I would definitely advise anyone to get the shell. Now, I have had comments to say that some people like the repro silicon membranes and that the original ones feel a little worn and the new ones feel a bit more responsive. It depends on which ones you get. A lot of the reproduction buttons that you can get for the Game Boy Color are a lot flatter and they're okay to play with, but they feel a little unusual. The newer ones made by Funny Playing, like the purple clear ones I've got here, are actually really good. They're smooth to the touch. There's a nice little dip to the D-pad. There's a nice curved surface to the A and B buttons. They are really good. So it depends on which ones you get. Of course, my clear ones that I've got in my FPGBC are also nice and smooth and curved. So yeah, there's a lot to be said for some of the reproduction buttons, but it depends on which ones you get and how much you spend. So I would say at the moment, these are our top 3 contenders when it comes to replacement screens for your Game Boy Color. And that doesn't really count for the FPGBC because that is a whole new piece of hardware. But if you want a modern means of being able to play original Game Boy cartridges, that's the measure that we're using here. These are all ways of using your original cartridges on a piece of hardware that looks and feels like a Nintendo Game Boy Color with a vastly upgraded screen from the original. Now, in the case of all 3 of these, the size of the display is bigger. That's what they call this Q5 display that we've got here on the IPS, which is also, I think, possibly slightly bigger than the OLED display. Definitely on the FPGBC, you can scale it down, but when it's upscaled to the larger size, it is huge compared to the others, and it is really, really nice to play on. The height of the display on the Q5 is 45 millimeters, and the height of the display on the OLED is 42 millimeters, so ever so slightly smaller. There are IPS kits that you can get that have a smaller display. The earlier ones that came out were even smaller than the original display, and then they started getting a little bit bigger, and then a sort of oversized one came out, which is this one, which needed a larger aperture on the lens, and then it's come to this point now. This is like the best IPS kit that you can get. It has a laminated display, which means that the lens is attached directly to the screen with no gap in between. You get a much better viewing experience. There's no dust or bits ever going to be trapped in between the lens and the screen. If you look at the original one, you can see there is a slight gap between the screen and the lens, and that's where you could get all the dust and bits and pieces caught. Until recently, this was the absolute best screen that you can get, and to be honest, there is still a lot to be said for this display, even in comparison to the other two. Now, a lot of these have features on them, like we've got a touch pad at the top here, so there's like a little capacitive touch sensor which will give you options over your controls. So if you tap there, it goes to like the dimmest setting, and then you can tap again and again and sort of cycle through different levels of brightness. And it is hard to know where you are on those levels of brightness, and when you think I've just about got it bright enough, I'll try and go a little bit brighter, and then it goes dim again. That can be a bit frustrating. It does feel a little bit like you're flying blind with these controls. However, the fact that you can adjust these things is pretty good. Also, if I bring it up a bit closer there, this has the pixel grid enabled. Now this makes it look more like the original, which was a pixelated display. It's kind of exaggerated when you actually look at it side by side. The pixels on the original aren't that obvious, whereas with that grid overlay it is kind of very obvious, but it does feel more like an original dot matrix type LCD. You lose a little bit of the brightness because you're overlaying these darker lines over the top of it. And in the interest of comparison between these, we're going to start off by having it without any of those overlays. And to get those to go away, you tap and hold and wait for that to change, which can be a little bit frustrating. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So one of the disadvantages to this display is relying on the touchpad, which is a clever thing to be able to use, but not really that easy to get set up. I've found once I get it set to how I like it, I don't do anything else with it. Right, so I finally managed to get that to display without the screen overlay, and that is just the general display, which is much more comparable to these other two. Okay, so let's take a look at the FPGBC. Now this one has a whole custom replacement motherboard inside, which does offer some additional features, and this has an on-screen display. So the volume dial's being replaced with an extra control button, and if you push that in, it brings up this whole display option. You can swap between the different cores, because of course I'm playing an original Game Boy game here, and if you're playing that on the original Game Boy, the display would not be in color like this, and you can swap to the other display by changing the core. So if I change this to the Game Boy core and then save that and reset, it will reload with the color palette of the original Game Boy, and it's kind of like the Game Boy Pocket, which is nice, and it's quite nice to play, and you get a nice clear contrast when you're playing your games. But there is a slight blue tinge to it. Now you can change from a range of different palettes. So I'm on the 06 palette at the moment. 07's at like a darker blue, purple, pinks, oranges, and so on. You can cycle through, and there's 12 different palettes. So the first one is a kind of a black and white. The second one has a slight greenish tinge, slightly greener still, then bluish. And I've found that one's kind of the closest to the Game Boy Color, but I'm just going to take it back to the black and white type one, and then just come out of that display. And then we're going to take a look at the one that we haven't really looked at very much so far, which is the OLED display. Now this currently has the vertical overlay on it. I don't know how I ended up with that on there. But what we'll do is we'll take that off. Now this has a touchscreen display, which aside from being a fingerprint magnet is a very handy feature. So this is currently on the Pixel FX 2, which is the vertical scan lines, which again, like if I go on to 3 and 4, that's like the pixel grid. It does look good, it does look authentic, but it does darken that image slightly. It helps with the contrast a little bit, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But for now, I'm just going to cycle through and turn that back to 1, so there's no overlay. The color mode on this is on 1. Now I don't need to swap between different cores to change this one. I can just go on to color mode 2. Yeah, if you leave that touchscreen display for a little while without touching it, it will go away. If I go on to color mode 2, really on this, color mode 1 and 2 are the only ones worth bothering with, and color mode 1 looks fantastic, but can be a little overly saturated. I've found playing Tetris, it's a little difficult to make out some of the details sometimes, but when it's set up like this, it looks great. And I think side by side on these, I think that the contrast on the OLED, despite it being smaller, makes it much easier to play than the larger IPS screen on the FPGBC. I think that the color itself isn't quite a kind of cold black and white. It's slightly more gray. And as I say, it looks very, very, very close to how the original Game Boy Pocket looked. I should have really brought out Game Boy Pocket to show it side by side. I'll go and grab one in a bit and we can have a look at that. But for now, yeah, I think that is really nice. But all of these other display modes that it's got, bluish tinge and a pinkish tinge and a yellow tinge and an orange. Now, I've said before, to me, these are not useful. However, I am not everyone, and sometimes these things can be useful. So if you've tried this and you thought, why have they got all these? Why are they any good? If you have dyslexia or if you've got visual stress, having that sort of blue tint to the screen, particularly if you're playing text-based games, like RPGs and things like that, this could be really useful. Having a slight blue tint to the screen could help an awful lot in terms of being able to see and read what's going on the screen without having any visual stress. So these features, like I say, sometimes there are features that are quite inclusive and quite helpful for a minority of people. But just because the majority don't find them useful doesn't mean they don't need to be in there. It's not doing any harm by it being in there. So I think it's great that we do have all of these options. For me, it's either the color mode 2, which looks very much like the Game Boy Pocket. So I'll go and grab a Game Boy Pocket in a bit so we can look at those two side by side. However, we are going to do most of the comparisons here on the color mode 1. And I'm going to put the brightness in this case right up. Now with this one of my favorite advantages are it doesn't cycle through the colors. So yeah, you have to go to take it all the way back down, but you don't have that unpredictability of like when we're tapping on the top and then suddenly the display disappears. So if I'm trying to change the brightness level on this one, I think, you see, so we're on the dimmest and then we go 1, 2, but we can't really count because sometimes it doesn't go that bright. So I'll just try and judge it by eye. I think that's like the brightest. When I look at those two side by side, the contrast on the OLED is very, very good. I think that the actual colors themselves look a bit slightly more muted on the IPS, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think they look, particularly if you look at that main title screen, I think it's a little bit overly saturated. It's hard to see like the little stars in the background like you can see on there. I think that for this game in particular, you would need to have the brightness turned down where you wouldn't necessarily have to do it with the IPS. So on here, I'm just going to try and get it to a level where I think it looks good and just knock our brightness down to about an 8. And then you press elsewhere on the screen to get that to go away. I think with that on about an 8, it looks much better. You can kind of make out those colors. Don't forget, like on the original, the colors were very muted, so it's almost like a sepia tone to what's on there. So when you compare that to these two, this is a little more faithful to the original. Now I'm going to take this off its black and white mode. So again, I'm going to go to the core and change that to the Game Boy Color. And then just save that setting and reset. So this will reboot into the full color mode. That's an IPS screen. This is an IPS screen. We're just using more of the display area on this. So color-wise, the color palette is kind of exactly the same on both of those. You do lose a little bit of the definition of the individual pixels by having the larger display, and it doesn't always get it quite right, but it is pretty good. And again, if we wanted to do a bit more of an accurate comparison, we've got loads of settings in this system. So I'm going to change this one so it's got the display mode on the integer scale ×4. And then if you look at these two side by side, they are pretty much identical, and both of them are fantastic. This one's slightly brighter, but I think that's just because I got the brightness turned right up. Yeah, that's on its maximum brightness, so possibly this one is very slightly brighter than the other, but really there's not much in it. I would say if you get the Q5 IPS display for the Game Boy Color, or you've got the FPGBC, which is a whole kit to build an entire Game Boy, your display is going to be pretty much the same. You have one advantage to this one that this one doesn't have, and this has an advantage that that one doesn't have. So obviously we've already talked about this one. My favorite thing, the main advantage about this one, is that on our display we can change it to full screen display, and you get that absolutely huge display on the screen, and it makes it, I mean, you know, I'm getting on a bit and my eyes aren't what they used to be. Having a larger display really is an advantage to me and would make me choose the larger display over a smaller, more accurate display. Again, personal preference, personal circumstances will dictate what makes one better than the other. This one has the advantage because I've got this in a green shell with an orange lens and purple buttons, and I've got a purple Game Boy Color logo here. This logo is really cleverly done because it's backlit, but it doesn't look like it's backlit. But if we press, I think it's start and select at the same time and hold it, it brings up these options here, Game Boy Color. Now game will allow you to change the linear or vertical positioning. I think you can move it to the left and right, the overall display. When it's on Boy, by just tapping up there, you can swap to the Boy one, and then if you are changing with the start and select left and right, it'll move it up or down, so you can center your display if it's slightly off center. That's a feature that's more useful for a non-laminated display. If you're just sort of positioning the screen, you've got it slightly off, instead of having to take it out and move it all around, you can just navigate it with that. And finally, if we tap again on top, we go to color, and that's where we can cycle through lots of different colors. So I've now got a red background, I've got a sort of teal background, I've got an orange. I can keep going until maybe I find a green to have as my display instead, or you can have it as just solid black. There we go. So we got like a nice bright green. Let's go with that one. Press and hold these two and it will go back to your whole display. So now I've got that whole thing, but with the green Game Boy Color logo. And of course, with this taking up so much real estate in the lens, we don't have room for a logo on this one, so it doesn't have that feature. So if that's something that you want, you're not going to get it on the FPGBC. Personally, I'm not that bothered because when I'm playing the game, I'm just looking at the game. But to be fair, being able to, I mean, look at that, being able to have the logo color coordinated with what you've got as your shell really customizes it, and it's a nice feature. And if you get a little bit bored, you can swap it to something else to contrast with it. Or say if I got a new set of buttons in here and I got, say, some pink buttons, I could change my logo to pink. It's a nice feature to have. These three for me are all excellent displays. They have their own advantages. I think in terms of the pixel grid overlays, let's just turn that on for each one. Oh God, we're back to trying to get this thing to respond again. Let's have a go anyway, because I want to get them with like the full pixel grid. So I'll do that again. So that's on vertical lines, horizontal lines, I think, and then full pixel. That's vertical. So we've got a few. It's like, it's a very harsh lines and then a subtle lines. So that's on like the pixelated one. I'm going to get this one and set that to the pixelated version, which I can do much more easily on this because I've got a touchscreen option, and I go on pixel effects 2, 3, 4, and then just turn that off. So that's with the pixel grid display. And then with this one, I am going to go on my display options, and that's on full at the moment. Now you can only have full without that. If you want the pixel grid, you have to go on the integer scaled option, so I'll just go on to that there. So that is now all of those with the pixel grid overlays turned on. These two side by side are very similar, but I think that the IPS original Q5 display looks the best with that overlay. If I compare it with the OLED, I don't think the pixel grid looks that good on this. It basically just makes it darker. This kind of crisps up the display a bit. This doesn't feel particularly better in terms of definition, although it does address that kind of saturation a little bit. It dials down that saturation. So I suppose it depends on what game you're playing, and you experiment with these different things and the lighting that you've got in the room and everything else. It's good to have options, isn't it? It's good to have all these different things to choose from. So yeah, I think my current personal favorite is this one with the grid lines switched off. So we'll turn the pixel effects off, and with the brightness dialed down a little bit to like maybe a 6. So I am finding that to be really good for the Game Boy Color games. IPS one I still really like, and as I say, I think this is the best one for when you've got the pixel grid overlay. This is the best one that feels like a more faithful representation of the original, albeit larger, more vibrant. Having the versatility to be able to change the logo makes that one really good. In terms of this one, the main advantage of this is the fact that unlike all of these other ones, you don't need to cannibalize an original Game Boy Color. Consoles like this one can remain intact for use as they were originally intended, but you can explore all these new modern features with an entirely new case. You can enjoy it without having to dismantle, take apart, or even destroy an original console. And I think that is a wonderful thing. Also, for me, if we go back to our displays, being able to have this full screen display, I would say a lot of the time I would rather pick this up and play it than play on the definitely more beautiful display on the OLED, simply just because it's easier for me with my eyesight to be able to play on the larger screen. I think having that is a real advantage to the FPGBC, as well as the fact that if you don't want to spend out and get hold of an original Game Boy Color to build something like this, you don't have to anymore. You can just buy this kit, put it together, and play most Game Boy games. Some don't work. So a couple more things to check. I mentioned earlier that I felt that the display on the OLED on that color mode 2 was most faithful to the Game Boy Pocket, and I think I was definitely going rose tinted spectacles there, because this is the display on the original Game Boy Pocket. It is very tricky to get the contrast just right between it being too dark to see and too light so everything's washed out. But if I get it so it's just about right there, it is a slightly greener tint of grey, certainly less black and white than on this one. So if I go through my options on there, as I say, the different colour modes, like when you get onto the green and things on there, are just, they're nowhere near the same. So this is the closest to the Pocket, but I think it does have that monochrome display. But it's, I love this thing, but this is much better, much easier to play on, and also doesn't quite have the same amount of ghosting. Like with the two side by side, like the pixels as they move, like the blocks moving and dropping, you have that slight ghosting on the original screen that you don't get on this. So yeah, that doesn't look quite as much like the original as I thought. Let's take a look at the color option on this one. We do need to go to the different core, which is something that you don't have to mess about with on the IPS or OLED screens, because it's a whole different piece of hardware. But if we go on a save and a reset there, and then we bring up our menu and we go to our color palette there, we can have these side by side, and looking at those, this is pretty, I mean, if we go to the main screen there, I would say actually I'm gonna have to take it back. I think that this is actually the more accurate rendition of the Game Boy Pocket display. Although having said that, I do really like that black and white. You can see there's just a lot to like about all of them. Now, I mentioned earlier about the shell color and the fact that this replacement yellow shell was a different shade of yellow to this one. And if you look here, it's much, I don't even know if the camera is going to pick it up. This, not only in terms of the shade of yellow, it's very close to this Game Boy Pocket, but also in terms of that slightly matte finish. This has much more in common with that console than it does with that one. And nostalgically, I have much more fondness for this one and the DMG in this style. So for me, this looks absolutely great. So I'm not going to go into anything technical, because to me, it's fun hearing all these numbers and what they're capable of doing and things, but it's more like the gameplay experience. And I find that you've got that flexibility, that versatility. Like if you want the controls to feel more like the original, you can keep your original silicon membranes, you can keep your original buttons, and visually there's not going to be much of a difference. If you want it to feel a bit more crisp and new and responsive, then you can use a whole new set of membranes and buttons. The shell though is like on this one, yes, it's a new upgraded shell, and it's got the USB-C charging because it's got a lithium polymer battery inside there instead of your traditional AA batteries that are in there. But something else that's quite interesting about this shell, which is definitely worth noting, is that if you take out the batteries from this one, and if you take out the batteries from the revolving compartment in this one, you will see that this has that whole line along the middle, and this one doesn't. And what that means is that if you want to, you can get a lithium polymer upgrade kit to put one of these sort of batteries inside here, and this shell is capable of doing that. You don't have to do any cutting. So if you wanted to do that battery upgrade, you could do it without any hassle. If you want to use the AA's, and thank you to Xstar for sending me these, which I'm currently in the process of testing out, you can use your AA batteries. So that versatility, I think, is really important. And I've put the wrong battery cover on. There we go. So we've established that these two displays are very similar. I prefer this one purely because being able to just push a button and navigate through an on-screen display is better than blindly tapping through some touch options on top. All of our testing so far has been done with the original and best, to me, Tetris game, but that's all about how it displays Game Boy games, and that's not necessarily all that we're doing. These are Game Boy Color consoles. They display in color. Yes, they can convert the original monochrome Game Boy games into a richer color palette like we've got here. However, they are Game Boy Colors, so we're going to test out some Game Boy Color games in there as well. So I've managed to find 2 copies of Tetris DX so we can compare the two side by side. Obviously, on this one, I've still got it on the monochrome mode. You can still play it in that case because you could get like Game Boy Color game cartridges are like this. They come in these like clear shells with like the bump on there. They will only work on a Game Boy Color, and a lot of the time it says only for Game Boy Color. But if you've got the ones that have a grey cartridge, then that is for the original Game Boy, and the Game Boy Color will enhance the color palette. But there's also ones that are slightly in between. If you've got it with a cartridge shell like this, but it is black, it means that it will work on a original Game Boy. So if I was to put it in this Game Boy Pocket, it would still work, but it will just display in a monochrome display like this. But what we want in this case is we want it to be the original Game Boy Color display, because that's what we're comparing. So we'll go to color mode 1 and come out of there. This screen is now covered in fingerprints, which is the main downfall of that, but having the touchscreen is kind of cool. It's very modern technology on a very old console. As you can see here, you can play this absolutely fine on original Game Boy. So that's what it means when you've got those black cartridges. So if we put that one in here, this is where the OLED really comes into its own. Yes, it displays the original games well, but wow, when you've got it with your Game Boy Color games, that whole palette in use, it looks amazing. Really does look good. And I'm going to avoid saying incredible this time because I irritated myself by saying it far too many times last time. We will bring up our options and go to the Game Boy Color core. Oh yeah, I forgot about this. So one of the quirks with this, and don't forget, you are able to get a brand new piece of hardware that can play Nintendo games without having to take any original consoles apart. That is a great thing. But sometimes your displays might look a little bit weird, and thankfully there is an option that's just Game Boy Color fixed. So if your color palette looks really odd like this, you can change that to off, and then your display goes back to normal. So that's all okay. And now we can look at these two side by side, and I think that these, as I say, the Game Boy Color games is where this really comes into its own. I think it looks much, much better than the IPS. And don't get me wrong, the IPS looks really, really good, but I think the depth of color on this one and the sort of contrast between the colors, it is quite saturated. And when you think about the monochrome palette of the original Nintendo Game Boy Color, then yeah, it's not quite in keeping with the original there. But in terms of just that gameplay experience, particularly the contrast with the blacks, particularly if you're playing in a dark room, in a darker environment with the brightness turned down. It's really, really easy on the eye with this one with those blacks. Let's just turn off the lights while we're talking about that. So that is at its kind of dimmest. So if you're playing in a darker room, you might not want it. This might be too bright. So this one is capable of going a little more dim. But when you are actually playing, like if we're on the main screens there, I must have got this cartridge from Sam. It's got 2 XAAs, high scores on there still. But the contrast between the two is better on this one, but the fact that you can get this one to go dimmer might be something that matters to you. So yeah, that is it in terms of those. If we've learned anything here, it's that I have got too many Game Boys and I've got too many copies of Tetris. Although, can you have too many Game Boys? And to be honest, can you have too many copies of Tetris? I mentioned Alleyway before. This is one slight quirk of the FPGBC that I was unaware of when I was doing my original review video, but just something I wanted to show is that if you are playing Alleyway, there is a glitch. So it's playing the original game, and if you are playing on there, the paddle locks over at the left. You can't move it. You can fire the ball, but you can't move the paddle. So that is one slight drawback. There might be some slight compatibility issues, although that is the only one, and apparently that's a known issue with a lot of emulators for the Game Boy. So yeah, that is a bit of a slight disappointment, but this again is something that can possibly be addressed with firmware updates. You can't update the firmware on your original hardware. You can on this, which is a great feature. If we load up Alleyway on our, I can't even tell which one's which now. If we load up Alleyway on our OLED screen, I've currently got that on the very low brightness, but even then it looks really nice in this light here. And if we start there, you'll see that what should happen is that we can move our paddle left and right, so we can play our game and move and knock the ball and so on. So yeah, that's just one extra thing that I wanted to mention there. So many different things to compare and contrast. In terms of my picks, obviously these three are the ones that you should be considering. The OLED is the newest. It is gorgeous in terms of the contrast. The colors, I think, are a little bit oversaturated sometimes on certain games, particularly if you're playing original Game Boy games. The FPGBC, you can't just get that oversized screen. You have to get the whole setup. So that is something that you need to consider. Do you want the straightforward pick up and play nature of the Game Boy Color, or do you want something that maybe needs a little bit more tweaking but offers a lot more in terms of that flexibility? This is still quite a new display. If you can't get your hands on this, honestly, the IPS is still an excellent display, particularly if you've got the Q5 laminated display. It's easy to install. You can get the custom shell that it just drops straight into. It's got all the advantages of the OLED. You can change the color of display. There is the slight drawback that it's using the touch on top, but I think that's great. For me, I think all three are definite winners. You could get any one of these three and you shouldn't be disappointed, particularly when you compare it to that original display. All three of these are fantastic. Personally, I am very much enjoying the FPGBC. I love the fact that we can move confidently into the future without having to rely on the foibles of old hardware, without having to replace capacitors, without having to take apart existing consoles, without having to deal with battery corrosion and things like that. Being able to just build a whole new console that will play the classic games is a wonderful thing. And I think that the amount of flexibility you've got in terms of the features, the fact that you can upgrade that firmware so those features will keep getting better and better, I think is a great thing. But in terms of taking your authentic original hardware and upgrading it, this OLED screen with its touchscreen features, it's going to be hard to beat. But look at it. All of these are great. We're all winners. So yeah, quite a ramble. Again, sorry about how I made this amazing screen look on my camera. I need to look at my lighting setup and see if I can get something better if I'm doing more videos with this. However, I think we are very spoiled, aren't we? There's so many fantastic options for upgrading our Game Boy Color, and I love them all. I can't really pick a favorite, although, as I say, the one that I am most excited about at the moment is actually still the FPGBC. If you want to get hold of any of this upgrade stuff, your first stop should be Zed Labs. They support my channel with the affiliate link that I'll leave in the description. If you buy something from there, you'll get yourself a nice discount and you'll support my channel as well. And if you want to find out more about either the FPGBC or this OLED display, I'm going to leave a couple of links up here for you to watch that you might enjoy if you've not already seen them. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.